At 10236 Charing Cross Road, behind a sequence of hedges trimmed to a uniform height, a 5.3-acre estate sits in deliberate isolation from the surrounding streets of Los Angeles. The gates remain closed. The driveway, once marked by a constant rhythm of arrivals, now holds only the memory of repetition. Tires that no longer pass, engines that no longer idle. Inside, a Tudor-style mansion of approximately 20,000 square feet stands intact, its exterior preserved in the same dark timber framing and pale stucco that once suggested permanence rather than spectacle. There are 72 rooms. The corridors are still arranged to guide movement inward, towards spaces designed for gathering, for observation, for controlled access. A grotto remains carved into the landscape at the rear of the property. A pool reflects light in a way that has not changed in decades. The interior, largely restored after its most recent transfer of ownership, no longer carries the layered density of objects that once defined it. Furniture has been replaced. Textiles have been altered. Surfaces have been cleaned of accumulation. Nothing is visibly broken. And yet, the house does not function as it was designed to. It was built to operate as a stage without interruption, a private residence structured around continuous performance, where architecture directed attention, regulated proximity, and sustained an illusion of controlled excess. Every room once depended on presence. Every corridor assumed movement. The house required a constant audience, even when it claimed to be private. Now, it exists without that audience. The structure remains architecturally coherent, but its original purpose cannot be restored through preservation alone. The rooms still connect in the same sequence, but the logic that once animated them, visibility, access, anticipation, no longer governs anything within them. A house built to sustain an image now stands without the image it was designed to contain. What happens to a building when its meaning depended entirely on being seen? Long before it acquired its later identity, the land at 10236 Charing Cross Road did not suggest performance, spectacle, or cultural influence. It sat within a section of Los Angeles that was still defining its relationship to wealth, an area where estates were meant to withdraw rather than declare, where distance from the city center functioned as a form of privacy rather than status. In the early decades of the 20th century, this part of Holmby Hills was not yet synonymous with global visibility. It was one of several planned enclaves developed to accommodate a growing class of industrial wealth migrating westward. The intention was not to build monuments, but to replicate a quieter version of East Coast stability, large plots of land, restrained architectural styles, and an emphasis on discretion. The house itself was completed in 1927, commissioned by Arthur Letts Jr., the son of a successful department store magnate whose fortune had been built through retail expansion rather than inherited aristocracy. The structure followed the Tudor Revival style, a choice that was already becoming common among wealthy American clients seeking to associate themselves with an imagined European lineage. It was not an original architectural statement. It was an adoption. The design prioritized enclosure. Thick walls, narrow windows in certain sections, and a deliberate separation between interior and exterior spaces gave the house a sense of inward orientation. It was not designed to be seen from afar. Instead, it revealed itself gradually, through a driveway that curved just enough to prevent a direct view, through landscaping that softened the scale of the structure, and through a facade that emphasized texture over symmetry. At the time, there was no expectation that the house would become culturally significant. It was one of many large residences built during a period when Los Angeles was still negotiating its identity as a city of permanence rather than expansion. The estate functioned as a private residence for a family whose wealth, while considerable, did not require public display. Inside, the layout reflected a hierarchy that was common for houses of its scale. Formal rooms were positioned to receive guests, but their use was infrequent. Private quarters were insulated, designed for routine rather than ceremony. Service areas were concealed, allowing the operation of the household to remain invisible to those who occupied its central spaces. There was no central spectacle. No single room dominated the house in a way that demanded attention. Movement through the interior followed a logic of necessity rather than performance. Corridors connected spaces efficiently, without attempting to control the emotional experience of those passing through them. The house did not attempt to influence behavior beyond providing structure. For years, it remained exactly that, a structure that fulfilled its intended purpose without deviation. Ownership changed hands in ways that were unremarkable for properties of its scale. The estate passed through periods of maintenance and quiet adaptation, each new occupant altering details without redefining the whole. The architecture proved resilient in this way. It absorbed change without losing coherence, because it had not been built around a singular, fragile idea. It was, in essence, replaceable. The surrounding neighborhood evolved gradually. Other estates were constructed, each competing subtly through size, landscaping, or architectural refinement. Yet even as wealth in the area became more visible, it maintained a degree of restraint. Privacy remained the dominant value. Gates were installed not to invite curiosity, but to prevent it. The house at Charing Cross Road remained consistent with this environment. It did not attract attention beyond its immediate context. It did not host events that altered its function. It did not produce an identity separate from its role as a residence. There was no indication that it would. By the mid-20th century, Los Angeles itself had begun to change. The entertainment industry was consolidating its influence, and visibility was becoming a form of currency. Public image started to carry weight equal to, and sometimes greater than, financial stability. Certain spaces, studios, clubs, and private homes began to operate not just as locations, but as extensions of persona. But this particular house remained outside that transformation. Its architecture resisted exposure. Its layout did not facilitate large-scale gatherings. Its identity, such as it was, depended on continuity rather than reinvention. It existed in a city that was becoming increasingly performative, yet it had not been designed to participate in that performance. There was no reason to believe it ever would. At this stage, the house had no mythology attached to it, no narrative extended beyond ownership records and architectural description. It was not a destination. It was not referenced in media. It did not symbolize anything beyond a certain level of economic stability. Its future was not yet constrained by expectation. And because it had not been built to represent an idea, it was not vulnerable to the collapse of one. That vulnerability would come later, introduced not by the structure itself, but by a new form of ambition, one that required the house to become something it had never been designed to sustain. When Hugh Hefner acquired the estate in 1971, the structure did not change immediately in form. The Tudor facade remained intact. The timber framing still suggested continuity with an imagined past. From the outside, the house retained its original restraint, as though it continued to belong to a different era. The transformation occurred within. Hefner did not rebuild the mansion. He repurposed it. The architecture, originally designed for privacy and hierarchy, was reinterpreted as a system for access and control. What had once been a residence structured around family life became a mechanism for orchestrating presence. Who entered, who remained, and who was seen. The scale of the house, approximately 20,000 square feet, was not extraordinary by the standards of the neighborhood. Larger estates existed, some with more land, others with more elaborate architectural detailing. But Hefner's intervention did not depend on expansion. It depended on concentration. Rooms were assigned new functions that altered the internal logic of movement. Spaces that had once been transitional, corridors, secondary lounges, connecting rooms, were repositioned as thresholds. To pass through them was no longer incidental. Movement became a sequence, and that sequence could be controlled. Access was not simply permitted or denied, it was staged. The Great Hall, originally intended as a formal receiving space, became a point of orientation. From there, the house extended outward into zones of varying visibility. Some areas were designed for observation, where presence could be registered and measured. Others were concealed, accessible only through a series of permissions that were never formally defined but always understood. The mansion began to function less like a home and more like a controlled environment. Outside, The grounds were reconfigured to support this internal system. The pool and grotto, features that had existed in earlier forms, were reshaped to accommodate prolonged use rather than occasional recreation. Landscaping was adjusted to create pockets of enclosure within the larger property, allowing multiple activities to occur simultaneously without fully intersecting. The estate's 5.3 acres were not expanded, but they were densified in meaning. Every section of the property was assigned a role within a larger choreography. The tennis courts, the guesthouse, the animal enclosures, all became components of an ecosystem that extended beyond architecture into behavior. The house no longer ended at its walls. It extended into the routines it enforced. Inside, decoration accumulated. Objects were not selected for coherence but for effect. The interior became layered with artifacts, furnishings, photographs, memorabilia that resisted minimalism. Surfaces filled over time, creating a density that altered perception of space. Rooms appeared smaller, more contained, not because their dimensions had changed, but because their visual boundaries had been brought inward. The architecture began to compress. Lighting was adjusted to maintain a consistent atmosphere regardless of time. Curtains filtered natural light. Artificial illumination softened edges, reducing contrast and flattening depth. The house no longer responded to external conditions. It maintained its own internal climate, both visually and psychologically. Time became less distinct inside the mansion. The layout supported this effect. Bedrooms were positioned not as private retreats, but as extensions of the central system. Proximity to Hefner's own quarters became a form of spatial hierarchy. Distance carried meaning. The closer one was allowed to reside, the more integrated one became into the structure's daily rhythm. The building began to assign value through placement. Unlike traditional estates, where hierarchy was expressed through size or ornamentation, this mansion expressed it through access. Doors, corridors, and adjacency replaced scale as indicators of status. The architecture did not display power outwardly. It distributed it internally. The cost of these transformations is difficult to isolate in purely financial terms. While the purchase price of the estate was significant for its time, approximately $1.1 million, the ongoing investment was not directed towards structural expansion or architectural innovation. Instead, resources were absorbed into maintenance, modification, and the continuous production of environment. The house required constant adjustment to sustain its function. It was not designed to stabilize. In comparison to other estates in Holmby Hills, which often emphasize permanence through materials and proportion, the mansion began to operate as a mutable space. Its identity depended on repetition rather than endurance. Events, gatherings, and routines reinforced its purpose, but they also prevented it from settling into a fixed state. The architecture became dependent on activity. Without occupants moving through its corridors, without bodies filling its rooms, the system lost coherence. The design did not support absence. It required continuous input to maintain its structure, not physically, but functionally. This dependence distinguished it from other estates of similar scale. Where traditional mansions could remain dormant, closed for seasons, preserved through inactivity, this house could not. Its meaning was not embedded solely in its walls or its design. It was distributed across behaviors that had to be performed repeatedly. Hefner's ambition was not to create a lasting architectural legacy in the conventional sense. He did not commission a new structure to define his position. Instead, he adapted an existing one into a framework that could sustain an image, an environment where visibility, access, and exclusivity could be continuously produced. The mansion became a device. Its success was measured not by its durability, but by its ability to host, to attract, to maintain a specific form of attention. Every alteration, every addition, reinforced this objective. The house was no longer a static object. It was an active system. But systems of this kind require constant reinforcement. They do not endure through absence. They do not preserve themselves through silence. They function only as long as the conditions that sustain them remain in place. By the mid-1970s, The mansion had established a rhythm that did not correspond to the city beyond its gates. Days were not defined by external schedules, and nights did not conclude in the conventional sense. The house operated on a continuous cycle, sustained by the presence of those who moved through it and the expectations that governed their movement. Morning did not begin with light. Curtains remained drawn in many rooms, and artificial illumination maintained a consistent tone throughout the interior. The absence of natural variation created a form of temporal neutrality. Hours passed without clear markers. The house did not acknowledge the outside world unless it was necessary. Within this environment, routine replaced time. Staff moved through the mansion with precision, maintaining surfaces, preparing rooms, resetting spaces that had been used only hours before. Their work was designed to erase evidence of prior activity. By the time new occupants entered a room, it appeared unchanged, regardless of how many times it had been used. Continuity was preserved through removal. For guests and residents, movement through the house followed a different logic. Access was rarely explained directly, but it was understood through repetition. Certain rooms were always open. Others required proximity, both physical and social, to enter. The boundaries were not marked by locks or barriers, but by awareness. The architecture reinforced this system. Corridors narrowed and widened in ways that subtly guided behavior. Some spaces encouraged lingering, while others discouraged it. Seating arrangements positioned individuals in relation to one another, creating lines of sight that were difficult to ignore. Visibility was rarely accidental. To be present in the mansion was to be seen, even when no one was actively observing. At the center of this system was Hefner's private suite, positioned not as an isolated retreat but as a focal point. Its location within the house allowed it to function as both destination and origin. Movement toward it carried significance, and proximity to it shaped the experience of those within the mansion. The bedroom itself became one of the most controlled environments in the house. It was not simply a private space. It operated as an extension of the mansion's broader structure of access. Entry was regulated, not through formal rules, but through an evolving set of expectations that were reinforced by the architecture. The room's layout, its adjacency to other spaces, and its position within the house all contributed to its function. The building defined intimacy through placement. Residents, often young women whose presence was both social and performative, occupied bedrooms that were arranged in relation to Hefner's suite. The distance between rooms was not arbitrary. It created a hierarchy that was spatial rather than explicitly stated. Those closest were more integrated into the daily rhythm of the house. Those farther away existed on its periphery. The mansion assigned roles without formal designation. Daily life within the house involved a series of routines that were both repetitive and controlled. Meals were scheduled but not always communal. Movement between rooms followed patterns that became familiar over time. Certain areas, the game room, the screening room, the outdoor pool, served as recurring points of convergence. Yet even in these shared spaces, interaction was structured. Conversations occurred within an environment that constantly reminded participants of their position within the system. The architecture did not allow for complete informality. Sightlines remained open. Movement could be tracked. Privacy, when it existed, was temporary and conditional. The house did not eliminate isolation. It redefined it. Individuals could be surrounded by others and still remain separate, their experience shaped by where they were allowed to be and how long they were permitted to remain there. The mansion created proximity without necessarily creating connection. Over time, this environment produced a specific form of psychological pressure. Repetition reinforced expectation. Behavior adjusted to align with the structure. The absence of clear boundaries between public and private spaces blurred distinctions that might otherwise have provided stability. The house did not instruct directly, but it conditioned through design. Outside, the grounds extended this system. The grotto, partially concealed and enclosed by rock formations, offered a different form of space, one that suggested seclusion while remaining within the larger structure of the estate. The pool area, more open but still contained by landscaping, functioned as a stage where presence could be displayed. Even in these exterior spaces, movement was not entirely free. Paths were defined. Sight lines were considered. The design ensured that no area was completely disconnected from the rest of the property. The mansion's influence extended beyond its walls, shaping behavior across the entire estate. Events, which became a defining feature of the mansion's identity, did not disrupt this system. They intensified it. Large gatherings introduced more people into the structure, but they did not alter its logic. Instead, they amplified the existing patterns of movement and access. Guests navigated the same corridors, encountered the same thresholds, and experienced the same controlled visibility, only at a larger scale. The house absorbed them without changing. Over years, the distinction between daily life and event blurred. The mansion did not shift between modes. It maintained a continuous state of readiness, where every room could transition from private to performative without structural change. This continuity came at a cost. The building's dependence on constant presence meant that absence was not neutral. When rooms were empty, they did not rest. They waited. The architecture, designed to guide and contain activity, had no alternative function. Silence did not belong to the house. And yet, it remained possible. Not as a natural condition, but as something that would emerge only when the system sustaining the mansion, its routines, its occupants, its continuous cycle of use, could no longer be maintained. The shift did not occur in a single moment. There was no event that immediately entered the mansion, no abrupt closure that marked the end of its function. Instead, the structure began to lose alignment with the conditions that had once sustained it. The system remained intact, but the environment outside the gates was no longer compatible with what the house required. By the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, visibility had changed. The mechanisms that once concentrated attention within specific spaces, magazines, curated events, controlled invitations, were being replaced by new forms of exposure that did not depend on physical location. Image no longer required architecture. Presence no longer required proximity. The mansion, which had functioned as a central node for a particular kind of visibility, was no longer necessary for its production. The house continued to operate, but its relevance began to thin. Events were still held. Guests still arrived. The routines persisted. Yet the relationship between the mansion and the culture it had helped shape was no longer reciprocal. The house no longer generated the image. It followed it. Inside, the system remained unchanged. Corridors still directed movement. Rooms still assigned hierarchy. Access was still regulated through proximity. But these mechanisms, once essential, began to feel excessive in a context where access could be simulated elsewhere, without the constraints of physical space. The architecture had not adapted. Its design assumed that control over environment equated to control over attention. That assumption no longer held. Attention had become decentralized, mobile, and increasingly detached from place. The mansion's internal logic, so precise, so dependent on sequence and containment, began to lose its effectiveness. The first signs of fracture were not structural. They were perceptual. What had once been exclusive became familiar. What had once required invitation became visible through other channels. The boundaries that the mansion enforced internally were no longer mirrored externally. The distinction between inside and outside began to erode. The house remained closed, but it was no longer inaccessible. By the time reality television introduced a more direct view into the mansion's interior life, the transformation was already underway. The environment that had been carefully controlled for decades was now being mediated through a format that did not require physical presence to participate. Viewers could observe the routines, the spaces, the interactions, without entering the architecture itself. The house was still functioning, but it had been translated. This translation altered its meaning. Rooms that had once derived significance from restricted access were now defined by their visibility. The bedroom, the game room, the grotto, spaces that had operated within a system of controlled proximity, became recognizable through repetition on screen. Their spatial logic remained intact, but their symbolic value shifted. The architecture was no longer experienced directly. It was consumed. This change did not immediately dismantle the system, but it weakened its foundation. The mansion had been designed to produce an environment where presence was essential. Once that environment could be accessed indirectly, the necessity of the physical space diminished. At the same time, the institutions surrounding the house began to contract. Playboy enterprises, which had once relied on the interplay between image and exclusivity, faced declining influence as its primary medium. Print lost cultural dominance. Revenue structures shifted. Audience expectations changed. The brand, once centralized around a controlled aesthetic, struggled to maintain coherence in a landscape that favored fragmentation. The mansion, as the physical embodiment of that brand, could not adjust at the same pace. Its architecture was fixed. Its system required continuity. It could not decentralize without losing its function entirely. While the company adapted, reducing scale, restructuring operations, the house remained dependent on a model that was no longer sustainable. The gap between structure and context widened. Within the mansion, routines continued, but they became increasingly detached from their original purpose. Events persisted, but their significance was no longer aligned with the broader cultural environment. The house was still performing, but the performance no longer produced the same effect. It had become self-referential. The turning point, when it came, was not defined by a single decision, but by accumulation. In 2016, the estate was sold. The transaction did not involve a public transformation of the house's function. There was no immediate redevelopment, no architectural reinvention. The structure remained, but its ownership shifted under conditions that reflected its altered position. The mansion, once central to a network of influence, was now a property to be transferred, valuable, but no longer indispensable. Hefner remained in residence under the terms of the sale. This arrangement preserved the appearance of continuity, but it also marked a fundamental change. The house no longer belonged to the system it had been built to support. It existed within a contractual framework rather than an autonomous one. Its function was maintained, but its authority had been reduced. The architecture had lost control over its own meaning. When Hefner died in 2017, the system that had sustained the mansion for decades could no longer be maintained in its original form. There was no mechanism for succession within the structure itself. The house had been organized around a central presence, and without that presence, its internal logic could not replicate itself. The routines ended. Rooms that had once required constant resetting began to remain unchanged. Corridors that had guided continuous movement became static. The architecture, designed to operate through repetition, encountered a condition it had never been built to accommodate: absence. From that point forward, the original vision of the mansion, its function as a controlled environment of visibility, access, and performance, could not survive. The building remained, but the system it depended on had collapsed beyond recovery. After 2017, the mansion entered a condition it had never been designed to sustain. There was no immediate abandonment. The structure did not fall into visible disrepair, nor was it dismantled or radically altered. Instead, it persisted in a suspended state, intact, maintained, but no longer operating within the system that had once defined it. Ownership had already transferred to Durham Metropolis, whose acquisition of the estate in 2016 was structured around preservation rather than reinvention. The terms of the purchase included a commitment to protect the exterior architecture and certain elements of the interior, effectively freezing the house within a set of physical constraints. This preservation, however, did not restore function. The mansion had been sustained not by its materials, but by its use. Its architecture depended on repetition, on the continuous movement of people through its rooms, on the maintenance of routines that gave structure to space. Without that movement, the house did not revert to a neutral state. It became something else. It became static. Rooms that had once required constant adjustment, cleaning, rearranging, preparation, began to hold their condition for extended periods. Furniture no longer shifted in response to use. Lighting, once calibrated to maintain atmosphere regardless of time, now illuminated spaces that did not change from hour to hour. The interior lost its variability. Restoration efforts focused on material integrity. Surfaces were repaired. Structural systems were updated. Elements that had deteriorated through continuous use were replaced or reinforced. In this sense, the mansion became more stable than it had been in decades. But stability introduced a contradiction. The house had not been designed for stillness. Its architecture assumed occupation. Corridors were proportioned for movement, not for emptiness. Rooms were scaled for gathering, not for absence. The spatial relationships that once created a sense of controlled proximity now produced distance. The same design that had once compressed space began to expand it. Without occupants to define scale, rooms appeared larger than before. The density that had characterized the interior, objects, bodies, activity, was reduced. Surfaces became visible in ways they had not been for years. The architecture, once obscured by accumulation, began to reassert itself. Details emerged. The Tudor framing, previously a backdrop to activity, became a primary visual element. The proportions of rooms, the alignment of corridors, the relationship between interior and exterior spaces, these features, long subordinated to function, regained clarity. The house revealed a version of itself that had been partially hidden. Yet this revelation did not resolve its identity. The mansion had been constructed in 1927 as a private residence, but that function had been fundamentally altered during its later transformation. It could not simply return to its original state. The modifications, both physical and conceptual, had redefined its internal logic. The building no longer supported conventional domestic life without contradiction. Its scale resisted intimacy. Its layout, structured around access and visibility, did not align with the expectations of a private household. Spaces that had once facilitated performance now lacked a clear purpose. The architecture, optimized for one system, could not fully adapt to another. The house existed between functions. Externally, it remained recognizable. The facade continued to suggest continuity with the past. The grounds, carefully maintained, preserved the impression of completeness. From the outside, there was little indication that the internal system had dissolved. But inside, the absence of that system was evident. The grotto, once integrated into a network of activity, became isolated. The pool, no longer a focal point of gathering, reflected only the surrounding architecture. The guesthouse, designed to accommodate a constant flow of occupants, stood without defined use. Each component retained its form, but not its function. This condition, preservation without purpose, extended beyond the physical structure. The cultural meaning of the mansion had also shifted. It remained known, but recognition no longer translated into relevance. The image persisted, detached from the environment that had produced it. The house had outlived its context. In contrast to other estates in Holmby Hills, which maintained their function as private residences or were adapted for new uses, the mansion resisted clear redefinition. Its identity was too specific, too closely tied to a particular system of behavior to be easily reassigned. It could be maintained. It could be restored. But it could not be replicated. The architecture had become singular in a way that limited its future. Any attempt to reintroduce activity into the mansion would have to contend with the absence of the original system that had given that activity meaning. Without the network of media, influence, and controlled visibility that once surrounded it, the house could not perform in the same way. It remained structurally complete, but its function, once so precisely defined, had dissolved into ambiguity. The mansion did not decay. It did not collapse. It persisted. And in that persistence, it revealed the limits of architecture that depends not on material endurance, but on the continuation of a specific cultural condition, one that, once altered, cannot be reconstructed through design alone. Late afternoon settles across the estate without interruption. Light moves slowly over the Tudor facade, catching the dark timber lines before fading across the pale stucco. The hedges remain precisely trimmed. The gates remain closed. No vehicles approach the curved driveway, and no sequence of arrivals breaks the stillness that now defines the property. Inside, the air is controlled, but undisturbed. Rooms hold their arrangement without adjustment. Chairs remain where they were last placed. Tables carry no new objects. The Great Hall, once a point of convergence, now extends outward into spaces that no longer anticipate use. The corridors remain aligned, but no movement completes their design. Sound does not travel far. Without voices, without footsteps, the architecture contains silence rather than activity. The proportions of each room, once calibrated to manage presence, now emphasize absence. Walls that once framed interaction now enclose nothing at all. The system has not been dismantled. Doors still open in the same sequence. The bedroom remains positioned at the center of the house. The pathways through the interior remain intact, waiting to direct movement that does not come. The architecture continues to offer its structure, but there is no longer a function to receive it. Outside, the pool reflects a fixed image. The grotto remains enclosed, unchanged in form. The grounds are maintained with precision, preserving a landscape designed for repetition. Nothing appears neglected. Nothing appears incomplete. And yet, nothing continues. The house stands as it was left, fully formed, carefully preserved, and no longer required to perform. Its materials endure. Its layout remains legible. Its presence is unchanged from a distance. But the conditions that once gave it meaning have not returned. It was built to contain an image that depended on being seen, repeated, and sustained through constant occupation. Without that occupation, the architecture does not disappear. It remains, holding a structure that no longer corresponds to anything beyond itself. A complete system, without a system to serve. The gates will remain closed. The rooms will remain intact. The sequence of spaces will remain available, indefinitely. But without the conditions that once animated it, the mansion no longer answers the question it was built to ask. Can a house designed entirely around performance continue to exist once there is no one left to perform, and no one left to watch?